I need to find it in the Quran. That one. Not really, no.
صلاة على محمد وآل محمد. We're now going to start the main program with the recitation of Surah Yasin by Zainab.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم مغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم 2 فكذبوهما فعززنا بالثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغن عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العظيم.
Thank you for that beautiful recitation. Brothers and sisters, please can I request you to recite Surah Fatiha for Fatma Jafar Ali Versi, who's the mother of Latifa, Ahmad, Murtaza, Riaz, and the late Nasreen Versi, who passed away a year ago, and to all Marhumin. Surah Fatiha. Now we're very fortunate to have Tim Calvey, who's the head teacher at Orley Farm School, speaking to us on the topic of It's Never Black and White, my journey from Zimbabwe to the UK. Let's welcome him with a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Education is in Tim's DNA. He was brought up in a boarding house run by his father in Zimbabwe and graduated from Christchurch University. He has held various roles, including deputy head at Eagle House and Orley Farm School. He's now head teacher at Orley Farm, where he's passionate about finding the right future school for his pupils. He favours a holistic approach to education, promoting sport and ensuring that children's well-being is considered alongside their academic progress.
That is very, very kind of you. Thank you for sharing those words. Can I start by saying a huge thank you for welcoming him, Zainab? This is very kind of you. Initially, I was invited to talk about Africa, my starting point in Africa, and I thought before I start, I just want to start with something that we do with children quite a lot. And if you want a great speaker, always go to the top. This is the top of Orley Farm School. It's run by pupils, and we had at the end of last term, Safia was an incredible speaker at Orley Farm, and I noticed that Ali's here as well. He gave a fantastic speech at Orley Farm for head of school, I think it was, wasn't it? So it's lovely to see so many amazing faces around here. But before we start, I just thought I would start with a very simple thought of how do we introduce ourselves. That was very kind of you, those words that you shared. But for the next 30 seconds, I just want you to turn to the person on your left. Imagine you've never met them before. Never met them before. I know it's probably family members, but imagine you've never met each other, and I want you to introduce yourself. You've got 30 seconds. Go. Tell each other something about yourselves. Okay, so that 30 seconds ends there. You see, you're still talking. This is like trying to control Orley Farm or my own family. Now, what I find interesting is that what we tend to do is adults tend to start off by introducing ourselves with facts about ourselves. I would start off by saying, I'm an educationist, I'm a head teacher. We talk about our degrees, I'm a father, I have 3 children. We define ourselves with a whole lot of numbers. But actually, if you go into a classroom and you say to a 4-year-old, introduce yourself, they'll normally say, hi, my name's Tim, and I like painting. Yes? They keep things very simple, and somehow over the course of our lives, we pick up things that we think are important, and they might be or they might not be important. And I guess for me, I like the theme of black and white because I grew up as a white man or a white boy in Africa. It was not Africa full of apartheid, it was Zimbabwe, which was a different place, but I had to leave Africa to realize the privilege that I had enjoyed. And when I look at black and white, I think it's more polarized than ever before. We're living in Brexit or Remain. We're living in Tory or Labour. We're living in left or right. But I think the biggest thing it boils down to is we're boiling it down to winning and losing. And I think that's where a lot of the conflict comes from. We need to have a sensation that we are winning and that we are not losing. And I think I'm noticing that as I've got older, the divides are getting bigger. And I find that sad. So hopefully, I don't quite know where this talk is going to go. So I hope some of it resonates with you and you find elements that maybe you can take away. But in terms of defining myself, I guess the reason why I'm here is because Zainab saw me and she said, I'd love you to talk about Africa. And I thought, I've never talked about Africa. And she said, you tend to often refer to her. And I suddenly realized how I've lived in this country since 1980. And yet I talk about my roots in Africa a lot, because if parents are able to pick up on this, and children at Orley Farm, probably, Ali, have I mentioned Africa before? Yeah, you see? And I was sort of, yeah, you have, Mr. Gaz. So that tells you that I probably talk about it too often. So let me just jump in with some reflections of my own. And bear in mind, these are very much, they've got a bias to them, because we all bring bias. So they're starting off from a position of bias. I grew up in southern Africa. So if we just zoom into, this is my understanding as a child of what was happening. I knew that we were in a position of conflict. I think as you think of the flags that I lived under, certainly my parents, Zimbabwe changed from a British colony, a state. It then gained independence, but it wasn't recognized independence. It called itself Rhodesian, and it declared UDI, but it wasn't recognized by the world. That was in my childhood, that was the flag that flew over Africa, over my home. That then changed to this flag, which is really interesting. This was Zimbabwe Rhodesia, which was a flag only for about a month, when suddenly white Africa, white Zimbabwe, white Rhodesia was realizing that it couldn't sustain itself any longer. And what's interesting, what I love about this flag, because we studied it at school, the person who designed it talked about this idea that at the heart there's black and there's white. On the flag there's black and there's white. But there's also red, and the red represents blood, bloodshed. And the green represents the fertile soil for growing crops. Rhodesia, Zimbabwe was an incredible farming nation in the middle of Africa. And then more recently, obviously, we then have the flag that we recognize today. So in terms of my understanding of the change in state was that Britain didn't really know what to do with this state. They knew that they were losing their empire. What I understand is that South Africa, but the sanctions were applied to Rhodesia, but South Africa were funding a huge amount. So a lot of weapons came up through South Africa, because South Africa wanted to keep countries off their border that were going through change. They didn't want to accept change. And then, as I also understand it, Russia and China were funding a huge amount of the insurrection. So I grew up, I knew from the day I was born, there was warfare happening around us. So if I just jump through some of the slides here, these were just some of my recollections. So this was my teacher, Mrs. Horsfall, and you can't quite see me. I'm the person directly behind her head, hiding. Now, I grew up with Mrs. Horsfall. She's a 60-year-old teacher. She was married to Mr. Horsfall, who ran the school. They had their house attacked and burned, and she came back into school the next day. She had a machine gun, which she used to hang with her coat on the back of the door. And I can remember when we came into school, one of the dares was for us as children to try to touch this gun. This is why we were lining up to have our spellings checked. We had alarms. So those of you children, you have fire alarms. We never had fire alarms, but we had attack alarms. And so we had to get under our desk, and Mrs. Horsfall, a 60-year-old lady, stood at the door with a gun, which, looking back on now, I find absolutely extraordinary that she did this. When I think of whenever I wanted to travel anywhere, we had to go in convoys. This was a truck that would take us to the dentist. You'd get into a line with 3 or 4 other cars because you didn't venture out of towns. And when I walked to school, I lived in a boarding house. My parents ran a boarding house for children from the local farms. The army used to come at the start of the day and the end of the day, and they would move us around the town. My mother carried a pistol. I never forget one of the strangest days. We went out for a picnic, and my mum sat behind my dad in the car, and she was clearing the pistol, and it went off in the car. And it went down past the seat of my father, which they laugh about now, and they talk about, was this a life insurance thing, or was this a strange threat from mum to say, you haven't washed the dishes? But every time we go back to Africa, we still go and find that car, because my aunt has the car, and we put our finger in the hole behind the seat where mum shot a bullet through the car. And these were things that were part and parcel of my childhood. My dad was a physics teacher, my mum was an English teacher, and my dad had to do national service. So what you found was the two families here with the two members here, parents with the child, they're on a farm, and they had teachers would come out and be bright lights. So if you were a teacher, if you weren't a trained soldier, you had to live on farms in army fatigues. So the gentleman on the right is a teacher from our school, and he had to do a month of bright lighting. Bright lighting meant that you went in farmers' vehicles, and the idea was you were just a deterrent. People didn't realize these were just teachers sitting in the back of trucks with guns. My father had to do that for 2 months of the year. Now, we lived in, this is a boarding house for the girls. There were 60 girls, all from farming families in the local area of Mzvingo. And when my father did his national services, 2 months, my mum was the only one at home with my brother and I. And the alarm used to go off. There's a fence. You can't really see it, but there's a security fence around the building. And my mum was in charge of this boarding house. I can't imagine. She was 35 years old. She was in charge of 80 children. And pretty much once a week, the alarm would go off. And it tended to be the chef. The chef used to come in late. He didn't have a key, and he would throw his bicycle over the fence, and it set the alarm off. And certainly for the first couple of months when the fence was set up, I look at my mum and just think, I don't know how she coped. My dad wasn't there, and she had to pick up a gun and go out to the fence and to see whether intruders were coming in, because often these schools were attacked. A lasting recollection was, this is my first time I've ever seen a police officer, a British police officer. So in 1980, when independence was pretty much a foregone conclusion, the only people who were trusted by the white Zimbabweans, or Rhodesians as they were, and the black, we knew them as terrorists, but I learned when I came to this country that they were freedom fighters. They wanted their country back, but the only people who they would all trust were British police officers. Now, these British police officers arrived in our town, there were 10 of them, and they only had truncheons. They had wooden truncheons, and they had something like 1,000 freedom fighters were outside our village, and they put their guns down. And the whole country trusted British soldiers, and the British soldiers had nothing. They had wooden truncheons. They were flown in from the UK to keep the peace. It was extraordinary. And I can remember they were all sunburned. They all wore trousers. None of us wore trousers. We wore shorts. And I remember just thinking, it's very strange that British police officers were in charge of our country for a month. This is a really strange thing. So I suppose I knew that things were changing rapidly, and we weren't allowed to leave the country. You weren't supposed to be leaving the country. And I knew they were changing fast. My older brother, who would have only been about 12 at the time, or 13, was being taught to shoot a rifle. And I think that was a tipping point where my parents decided that they didn't want to stay in the country. They didn't want... but how sad is this? I watched my brother shooting a rifle, and I wanted to shoot a rifle. Now, that's one of those sad moments where you realize the messaging. I've grown up in this environment. I was 10 years old, and I was envious of my brother because he was allowed to go to a range and shoot a rifle. And I think that's when my parents decided to leave. But you weren't allowed to take anything with you. So, and I knew as a 10-year-old, my dad was doing something really illegal. We sold everything. We still have a house. We had a house, but it was taken from my family. And my dad got 2 Krugerrand, 2 of these coins. And I can remember he put them in his socks, and we flew on an aeroplane, and I knew that these 2 Krugerrand were illegal. They were the only money that my dad could take out of the country because bank accounts had been frozen. So we kept... I'm going to finish this story with the Krugerrand because there's a funny ending to these Krugerrand. The Krugerrand, the whole point was that these 2 coins, if we really found it tough in the UK, at least we could sell these 2 gold coins, and we could use it for something. Arriving in this country with one job, my dad had got a job in a school. So I'll come back to the Kruger round later on. But I think one of the strange things as a youngster was watching how sad and how fearful my parents were. And it took them a very long time to settle in this country. Arriving in this country, I suppose that this is the first time I started to change my views, and I started to realize that all the stories I've been told about communism and terrorism, you started to realize that 200,000 white people were running a country. Yes, I shared a classroom with black people. This wasn't apartheid like South Africa. There were no signs saying white people, black people. But the reality is that 200,000 white people were running a country for 200,000 white people, and there were 5 million black people who weren't allowed to vote. And this is the first time I started to understand this. And it's quite hard when you suddenly realize all the stories you've been told they're unbalanced. They're one side of it. I've always lived with strange judgments when I talk about Africa. I think a lot of people assume that you're naturally racist. They make a judgment about you if you're a white person who grew up in Africa. What have I learned? I've definitely learned to question a lot more and to ask more. I don't believe a lot of what I read in the press. I think that it's important to read the other side of every story and to take time to really understand things. So it's made me a much more questioning kind of person. Adjusting to life in this school when we arrived, apparently I found it really hard to go to school because none of my teachers had guns. I found that very peculiar. For me, that I felt very unsafe. The army didn't turn up to take me to school every day, which I found strange as well for the first couple of months. One thing I noticed straight away, there were no fences. If you ever go to Zimbabwe, you'll see high walls and high fences. And the fences get higher and higher and higher, and you don't notice they're getting higher. My aunt only left Zimbabwe about 10 years ago, and she moved to Auckland. And she said, I can't believe it. You just go into your house and people leave their front doors open and there's no fences. If you grow up in Africa, you find that more and more fences go up. And you don't realize it because you keep talking about the fences are going to come down one day. We're going to live in harmony. But they don't. They keep getting higher and higher. I learned that children answered their teachers back. And my dad found that incredibly difficult. Because in Africa, if you ask a child, did you do that? They don't say no. They just, yes, sir, I did do that. Sorry, sir. And what's really strange here is I value the best parts of the British education system because it's more advanced. If you go to Africa, my friends were so respectful. Here's a strange story. I was on my gap year, and I went out there with a friend, and we were backpacking around Africa. And I must have looked awful. I hadn't shaved. And we went into one of the ablution blocks, and there was a school trip there. They were camping in the middle of a game park. And there were 5 boys having a shower. And these 5 boys put their towels around them, and they stepped, and they called us sir. Can you imagine calling you sir? I mean, we looked hairy, we had bags, and we must have been quite smelly. We'd been on the back of a truck for about 2 weeks, hitchhiking around Africa. And these 5 boys came out of the showers and said, sir, you need to use these showers. And I said, no, boys, you need to finish showering. Anyway, I found their teacher afterwards. Their teacher came and said, were those boys being rude? I said, no, they were incredibly respectful. And they'd stood outside for the entire time that we showered. Now, that wouldn't happen in this country, I don't think. But what's strange is that equally, when I look at those boys, when they turn 18, they don't know how to behave because they don't have a teacher telling them what to do. And that's when they behave very differently. And when I think of myself as a 16-year-old in this country, I think there's something really good about the fact that we can question. Young people can question older people. I'm going to come back to that later on because I value that. You know, as an educator, I want young people to say, why are we doing this? Because you'd be amazed at how powerful their voices are. I don't want children to just do as they're told. I want children, I'm not talking about rudely, they need to do it in a certain way, but they need to learn that actually to say, why are we doing this? Because it makes me think, and I need to find a good reason for us to be doing something. I find African tribal culture fascinating. And again, I'll come back to that because I've visited Africa more recently, and I'll tell more about that. But Africa, for example, had its first recorded case. Now, I know this is not scientific, but had its first recorded case of dementia about 5 years ago. And I think it's because their cultures, their family cultures are strong. They have bonds. And I think Britain or Western world could learn a lot about understanding family cultures and valuing them with a stronger sense. Let me go back to that Krugerrand. So we bought these 2 Krugerrand, and they were going to save us. And I can remember when friends came round, I'd get these Krugerrand out of they were just kept in my dad's drawer, and we'd play heads and tails with them, these heavy gold coins. They were there to save us. So anyway, my parents obviously both got jobs. They got on their feet and what have you. And about 10 years went by, and my dad said, you know, we can sell these. We don't need them. We don't need them for a rainy day. So do you know what we bought with 2 Krugerrand? Do you remember when video players first came out? The older generation, I don't mean to be rude here. Do you remember there were 2 types of video recorder? There was Betamax. Do you remember Betamax? And VHS. My dad bought a Betamax, which was the one that became obsolete within less than a year. So 2 Krugerrand, his entire livelihood went into 2 coins that 20 years later he sold for a Betamax video. And by the way, just on that, this is what I bought. So, Ali, I want you to imagine all your savings accounts, children, all the children in this room. You know how when you have a birthday party, do you all have bank accounts? Some of you have bank accounts? And mums and dads say, I'm going to put that in the bank account. And you want the money for yourself, don't you? But you have to put it into a bank account because one day that's... Now, I got told when I was 10 years old, there's no point in having a bank account. So we're going to go out and spend money. And this is the watch that I bought as a 10-year-old. And I still have it. And I wanted a digital watch because digital watches were cool. And my dad said, you can't have a digital watch because it'll run out of batteries. And I still have that. Parents can be wise, Ali. Right, let me jump into a few other bits and bobs. What I really wonder is, what about all these children in this photograph? Because I'm one of them. But how many? What are they doing now? They're smiling, they're happy. But I wonder what they're doing now, because I haven't kept in touch with any of them. I've kept in touch with my family, but we all ended up in different parts. And I wonder if this talk were being held today by one of the black children in this picture. I wonder what their story would be. I wonder how they've had the chance to do things, because I'm very aware that whilst my story sounds interesting, that my parents, we had fear, we had guns, we also had choice. And I wonder whether these boys and girls in here, I'd love to know what their stories would be. So let's jump forwards. This is my family today. I take them out to Africa as often as I can, because I think it's important for them to understand different parts of the world. Here they were doing a jump at the Masai Mara. They do a jump, and if they jump high enough, they can marry someone within the tribe. And I think my son on the left, Joseph, he jumped the highest. And at one point, I think he looked quite nervous because someone said, you need to choose someone to marry. And I think he suddenly thought, I shouldn't have jumped quite so high because I don't think I'm ready to be married. We often go to schools, and I love dropping into African schools because when I come back to the UK, I realise how lucky I am. Equally, that we can learn a lot, because I think one of the fundamental differences in Africa, they realise the power of education. They realise that education is the only way to better yourself. Whereas I think in this country it's taken for granted, and we've lost something with that. But I want to go back here to African culture. So this is Daniel with his arm around my daughter. And this leans back into that story of tribalism, I suppose. So my daughter was walking with Daniel here, and we were talking about choices, and he was showing us around his village, and I said, so what do you do? And he said, I'm doing a computer science degree in Nairobi. So I said, right, so what are you doing back here? And he said, that's part of the deal. That's part of the deal. For me to do my computer science degree, I had to go to the elders in the village, and I had to get permission to leave the village to study. And in return, they took a long time to think about it, but when they finally agreed that yes, I could go out to Nairobi and get my degree, the deal was I had to come back to the village, and I had to put something back into the village. So once a month he goes, it's the best part of 400 miles, he will travel to go back to the village. And there's something about tribes, families, that actually, the way that we're going to beat dementia is that we shouldn't go into old age homes. We should have young people asking questions. We should have young people challenging us about our views. Because if we don't have young people challenging us, we're not going to remain relevant. And if we're not relevant, we're not good in terms of giving our advice to young people who might not want to hear it and may not pay attention to it, but they will one day. All the stories I've just told you about my parents, I took them for granted. They grew up in Africa, and they gave a lot up for me to be where I am today. I want to jump into this. I don't know if you've seen this video clip, and I apologize if you have. I love this video clip. So just, if you could just let this land and see where it goes in your world.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
It's Alaha, is it?
That's correct. Okay. I'm originally from Kurdistan in Iran, but I'm a political refugee, and I came to Denmark with my siblings and my parents when I was 6 years old. This is a Kurdish wedding with my mom in the traditional Kurdish clothes, and the same goes to my father.
So how much of your family background do you think is Kurdish?
I hate that question. I know that we've been, you know, the Kurdish people are people who've been... Oh, I have to be... We don't have a country anymore. And we haven't had it for a long time. And when you're a people like me, you don't even know exactly what your grandparents are, you know, if you look at the blood. But we are confident enough to say that we are people on our own, even though what we've been through, you know.
So your family has been through a lot as Kurds?
Yeah.
And you know about that? Think about other countries and other nationalities in the world. Are there any that you don't feel you get on with well, or you won't like particularly?
I have this side of me that's like, hey, we are all humans, and boom, boom, boom. And this side of me is that hates Turkish people. Not people, but the government.
How would you feel about going on a journey based on your own DNA?
Yeah, that would be exciting. And scary in a good way.
I need you to spit in this tube for me. You spit up to the little black line.
Sorry.
Right, the story of you is in that tube. What are you hoping to find?
This sounds so like a big cliche, but maybe like that we are all equal, that there's not a big difference between you and me. And
Alaha, you want to come down?
yeah. Hello.
Hello. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So how's the last couple of weeks been for you?
Now I've been thinking, what the heck is Kurdish, and how do I tell people that I am Kurdish? So I'm maybe in a bit of conflict somehow.
So what would be the biggest surprise for you in these results?
Doesn't matter what that bit of paper says, you're still Alaha, right? You're still you. Maybe it will tell you just a little bit more about you. Do you want to have a look?
Yeah.
You ready?
I am. Wow, look at me. What? Okay, 79% from Iran and Caucasus, which was Turkish.
Yeah.
Jewish, European Jewish. That's funny. Yeah, I knew that it wouldn't say that you're Kurdish. And that's what makes me a bit sad too, in a way, because I can't tell people that I'm Kurdish.
What? Why? This is one part of who you are. We're made of many parts. You're still Elaha. You're still Kurdish.
Now a bit Jewish.
You can be both.
Oh,
But those places you don't like,
yeah,
they're full of people like you.
I know. And that it's because, like me, you mean like,
Well, they're full of people that are the same ethnic mix that you are.
now it gets political, but it's the government I don't like, so it's
The
not.
politics is not the people.
No, exactly.
In a way, we're all kind of cousins, in a broad sense. In a much more direct sense, you have a cousin in this room.
What?
When we were doing all these tests, one of the things it does is it looks through the 1.5 million people in our database and finds cousins. It just so happens one of those cousins is sitting up there behind you. Turn around and guess who it is.
I think I know who it is. Where are you?
Wash,
Yeah. What's that?
why don't you come down here and meet your cousin?
God, this is amazing.
Did you know that?
I didn't know I did. This is like, my heart's pounding right now, I swear to God. I swear, man, I'm shaking as well.
Come here, cousin.
Hello.
What?
Give me a cousin, like that, like direct, what?
Yeah, so the way we do it is we look at the genes that you both share in common. And we can estimate how far back you had a common ancestor. This is an estimate, but it's a very, very good estimate. And so we are 99.96% sure that you guys shared a common ancestor somewhere between 150 and 225 years ago. You had a
Oh my God.
great-great-great-great-great-grandparent. When we saw the results that linked the two of you together, I had to double check it because like this is such a random selection of people,
Kind of jittery.
right? From from all over the world, and yeah, like the odds must be astronomical.
Sorry, this is just a lot to take in right now. I'm just lost for words. Oh my God, that's so crazy. We met.
And I think if I can close with, I love that piece. We've shown it at school before because I think we have a lot more in common. If we take the politics out, I think that's one of the most important things, to remove politics, because once that's gone, we realise we're all in the same room and we have more in common than we're ever going to realise. If you ever get the chance to travel to Zimbabwe, I don't work for the tourist board, but it's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. The people are so friendly and so gentle. The country is remarkable. And it's a beautiful part of the world. So do travel there. Are there any questions that people have for me? Sorry, if you have taken something from this, great. If you haven't, it's probably because I didn't plan it well enough. But I hope there's been some common messages that you can take. But are there any questions?
Thank you. Any questions from either side?
Oh. No questions?
Do people still carry guns in Rhodesia? So do we have to be careful if we go there?
No, I think it's...
And I noticed you went to Kenya, obviously.
Yes, so Kenya, Tanzania. I'm obsessed with Africa. And it goes back to how we started. When I said, how do you introduce yourself? I quickly mentioned Africa, and I think that's partly because I'm homeless. I feel that I don't have a home because I don't feel that the UK is my home. And it should be. I've lived here more of my life than Africa, but there's a part of me in Africa. But it's a very peaceful, beautiful place. And do people have guns? No. Is it a stable country? No. Not as stable as it should be, considering it's had 30 years, 40 years of independence. I think there's still a lack of understanding, a lack of ownership that it should have by now.
So if you had at that time DNA test between you and the black people, do you think there would have been some?
I don't know. I mean, the one thing I know about DNA is that there's a great book, I should have brought it with me, I meant to, which looks at DNA, and you have sub-Saharan Africa. So as the continents shifted, you have DNA that's entrenched in southern Africa, and then a group of people went across the Sahara. And I don't quote me on this, but the DNA that went across the Sahara still has sub-Saharan DNA in it, but it's a different DNA that then made it into Europe. And the reason, it's a fascinating book, and I will send the link through, but Africa has been largely left untouched because it doesn't have deep water ports. Its rivers are too fast flowing. Victoria Falls, if you saw that picture of Victoria Falls. So you can't, in terms of trade and in terms of transfer of ideas and technologies, it can't happen easily across Africa because it's a pretty inhospitable place, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
Sarah?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much. That was really inspiring. It made me nostalgic because I was born in Tanzania.
Ah.
Yeah. One question I had is more factual. Is growing up, the black schoolboys, were they locals or how were they part of the system?
So strangely, the government schools were good. The private schools in Africa were for the children who couldn't be taught. So the government schools were incredibly well funded. Black children could apply and would be accepted into them. So in my class, it was 50-50. But they came from the local environment. So Fort Victoria, which has now become Masvingo, that's where those families came from, whereas a lot of the white children tended to live on farms, which is why it was a boarding school. So there wasn't a big white population in Fort Victoria where I lived. It was predominantly a black black neighborhood, as it were. But there was harmony. You know, my dad, the teachers, there were black teachers in the school. There were my dad did his call-up duty with the police and with the bright lights on farms, and he was often with black soldiers. So it wasn't as simple as people portray it. There were black families who didn't like the way that the insurgents were working, and the insurgents, freedom fighters, however you want to see them. And don't get me wrong, the white security forces, I've read enough books now to know of the horrific things that went on. Both sides were guilty, as they always are, of too much, and yet the people caught in the middle often fixed problems themselves, if that makes sense. And any other questions?
Is it me next? Yeah. Tim, thank you so much for sharing
My pleasure.
your life story growing up in Africa. Grew up in Mombasa, a few hundred miles north of you.
Yes.
Very different story, and a lot of the people in this room saw me arrive as a 13-year-old spotty teenager in this country and the transformation since. One thing that has taken me back, particularly to the islands off the coast of East Africa, Zanzibar, Unguja, Pemba, and visiting schools there, and looking at 55 schools over the 11 provinces of Zanzibar, is to try and understand the learning environment that these schools are trying to portray. Most of what you recollect to us today did not have what your class 3 geography lesson or maths curriculum or science laboratory test resulted in, but life lessons. Now, if I look back at the remotest part of Pemba and the complex trigonometry that a child is expected to learn sitting on the floor with one textbook between 3 classrooms, no running water, going to visit the bush to relieve themselves, having incarcerated them for 7 or 11 years, they emerge with a 19% literacy rate, but every Ramadan read the Quran cover to cover.
Wow.
So
that's extraordinary.
How literacy is measured, how life skills are measured. 95% of them will probably not travel more than 20 kilometers from their village. Yet having been at school has taken them away from learning about agriculture, where food comes from, how to fish, where corals dug in to build a house. Is there something that you can reflect on the school journey you had, kids in Africa today have, kids in England today have, that can better prepare themselves to reflect on the lessons life need to build?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an educationalist, I think we're all chasing the wrong thing. I think the GCSE system and the A-level system is quite a dinosaur, and we don't know what to do with it, and we work backwards. So we're very blessed at Orley Farm. This is not a plug for Orley Farm, but we're very blessed to have a creative curriculum because we're not governed in the same way to live up to certain metrics, but ultimately children have got to fit into those metrics. So those GCSEs and A-levels, it's often called passport education, and the idea is that you are simply going through a series of tests to get you into a visa to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. And I think it was probably due a revolution a decade ago. I trained in 1996, came out, the UK was the last country, the last developed country to have a national curriculum. Can you believe it? And I think what made the British education system so unique is that it didn't have a national curriculum. So that made it outstanding in places and probably shocking in other places. We've standardized it now, but we've lost some of the magic because we're constantly teaching to the standard. And so the chances to explore interesting tangents aren't there. When I go back to Africa, I was too young to actually, all those metrics were probably still there, but I didn't feel them, I didn't see them. There was a bigger emphasis, I think, on manners and on discipline, but I think families held that as well, whereas I think that's definitely something that's very different today. There's less of an emphasis, and I think parenting today is harder than it's ever been. With mobile phones and every possible distraction, the idea of navigating parenthood, I think that's our biggest challenge, and that's why I think churches and mosques and synagogues and temples, I think, are precious because they give us a chance to do this. You've got all ages represented here, and you've all engaged in this, from the youngest, who are probably quite bored with me talking, especially children who may well have heard this already, some of these things. But isn't this amazing to have young people and all generations together? So opportunities to explore more, hopefully. Yeah.
Hello. Excuse me, I'd just like to ask, you're talking about Zimbabwe. Now, I'd just like to know, within the past 10 years, has it moved up economically? Like India has come up. I know Modi's, he doesn't like Christians, Muslims, but economically he's doing superbly well. Yeah. What about Zimbabwe? Has it progressed? Is education moving amongst the African people? Is it upsetting them that the resources in Africa is so much that wealth is not being distributed to the people, to the locals? Is it upsetting them? Are they educationally aware that they have to do something? Like, I know India is definitely waking up.
I think it's a really good question.
Is there a wake-up question in Rhodesia, in Zimbabwe?
I think it's a really good question. I think the people are probably far too optimistic and rely on hope. It's a very passive, gentle country, so I don't think they've pushed the current government as much as they have. When Mugabe, who was in power for about 30 years, when he went, there was this huge positive sense that the country was going to harness its natural resources, and it still hasn't. So I think it's... What I find most sad is that Britain is responsible for a huge amount of damage. I think it has tried in various ways. I think it's too embarrassed to go and help, and I don't know if the help is wanted anymore. So it's quite difficult to tread that path. But I think China, when I was last in Kenya, China are spending a fortune on infrastructure. Mombasa, there's the railway through the Rift Valley. China are definitely doing a huge amount in that space. Now, I don't know whether that's for good or for their own means and what have you. But I wish Africa would wake up, but I don't know that... The most embarrassing thing, I've got a friend who was born in Kenya, and he said, "You're responsible for the problem." And I said, what do you mean? He said, you are part of brain drain. You're a white person who has taken advantage of your starting point. You've come to the UK, and you always intended to go back to Africa, but you haven't. And what are you doing? Why aren't you going back to Africa? And it's a very good question, which I still can't answer. Probably because of my own children. I want them to... is predominant. I think Christianity's in Zimbabwe is probably one of the bigger faiths. But I think that's probably waning because of the way it was imposed in terms of missionaries going out there and pushing it. So I think Africa doesn't have strong faiths, recognized faiths. So that's one of their challenges as well in terms of bringing people together. Thank you, though. Good question.
Thank you for your talk. It's super interesting. I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about your experience unlearning a lot of your life and mentality that you were brought up with. You said that you moved here at a young age, so you must have been exposed to a different opinion, a different viewpoint, and what it was like traversing that change in perspective, really.
That's an absolutely brilliant question, and I probably ought to come back and do an entire talk on it, because if I'm honest, if someone had said to me at the age of 18, you'll be a teacher, I would have said there's zero chance of that happening. If they said you're going to be a head teacher, I'd say there's even less than zero. I don't know if there is such a way of putting that. I arrived in the UK, I hated school. I was in a co-educational school in Africa, and happy, barefoot, lots of outdoor education. I was quite naughty. That doesn't mean that you follow that, okay? And then when I came to the UK, I tried to fit in, and I found that incredibly difficult. I went from a country where I was wearing shorts, and it was a hot country. I came to this country. My dad's teaching certificate wasn't recognised in the UK because Rhodesia, as it was, didn't have a university. So he wasn't allowed to be employed in the state sector. So he had to go into a private school. So I ended up going into the private school that he taught in, and they wore shorts. It was all boys. Why would you wear shorts? It's snowing. I arrived from Africa where you wear shorts for good reason. I came to this country, and it was snowing. I thought, this is ridiculous. And I hated school. It was just with boys who were incredibly testosterone-fueled. And when I look back on some of the concepts and the way the behavior was amazing, the way that people talked about each other, I just found it... I survived school. And it was only when I left school that I realized the opportunities that came with it. I took 2 gap years. And I ended up working in an Anglo-French school, and that's where I discovered my love for teaching. And that's where I realized the power of inviting young people to challenge, why are we doing this? If you let children determine a huge amount of their timetable, their curriculum, their choices, their projects, you'd be amazed at how much more powerful it is. The moment you teach to a test, I don't know what your experience of education, but what I love the most about going back to Africa is simple things. My car broke down, and people came out and helped me fix it with a Coke can. And I remember just thinking, this is education. My car worked for an extra month with a Coke can that replaced, it had 2 Jubilee clips. Now in the UK, you take it to Quick Fit and say, I don't know what to do, and somebody would replace the whole thing. And in Africa, they make things work. They fix things. They've got a mentality that says you can't just go and buy another one. So I think we're far more resourceful in different parts of the world. And I think in this education system, we're almost like, the analogy I give to our children is that if you think of a nest with little beaks open and the mum comes and feeds them, that to me is the education system in the UK, because teachers and parents are so keen to get their children ahead in life that we want to keep filling them up with food. That's our job. And they haven't learnt to feed themselves. And I look at a lot of young people, and they haven't learnt to learn for themselves. They're just waiting for someone to tell me what to learn next. I'm not interested, but it's for a GCSE, fine, I'll do it. How uninspiring is that? So I think there's a lot to be done to make it interesting. And young people need to challenge education more than they do. They shouldn't accept it, because it's not fit for purpose at the moment. That's your route. Whereabouts are you at the moment in your educational...
I've graduated 2 years ago, so I'm working now.
Right, okay. So was it a good experience, school? I
related very strongly to the point you mentioned about being filled with information, just waiting for the next thing to learn. But...
And it's irrelevant, isn't it? Anyway, we must catch up at some stage, because I'd love to get your views. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your talk.
No, it's a pleasure.
I just have a quick question because you touched on how it was only when you came to the UK that you kind of understood the political environment in Zimbabwe better. And you mentioned a few times that you realized that what you've been told was essentially not as simple or wrong, etc. So I was just curious as to if you can elaborate on that a little bit more, and also where did that information, the false or inaccurate information, come from? Was it like what the government was saying, or your family, or the environment? If you could just touch on that a bit more, please.
No, again, really lovely question. I think there was a natural fear of change, because to give full representation to a country where 200,000 people choose the direction of a country, to give 5 million people the vote, I can see now they were terrified of what that could mean. And the saddest thing is that when it transitioned from Rhodesia, so Ian Smith was the Prime Minister, and he transitioned for 1 month into, I think there was a man called Bishop Mozawera, who was a black politician. And the idea was that Parliament would, for every white minister, there'd be a black minister. So you'd have this transition, you'd have this peaceful transition. And if that had been done, that was done in 1979. If that had been done in 1970, I think Zimbabwe could have done something unique. It could have been one of the few countries in Africa to transition healthily and with growth and with understanding, as opposed to with fear and with distrust. And so, to answer your question, the messages came from government. They were inculcated. I can remember people talking about the communists. The communists are coming. I was 8 years old. I didn't know what a communist was, but I was terrified of a communist. I thought a communist was a different looking person. You know, all the people I knew, they're not communists, but the communists are coming. And as an 8-year-old, I remember thinking, I hope I recognize these people when they come into my world, because I've got to see them, I've got to notice them. And that, how does an 8-year-old have a fear of communism? That's a government calling, that's propaganda. And my parents believed it. And my parents found it hard. When we came to this country, we watched Panorama. My dad found it very difficult. And still, when I meet his generation of Rhodesians, they find it very difficult. You know, they feel that they've lost something. And they have. You know, they lost a lifestyle that was not fair. They lost swimming pools and tennis courts. They had big houses. And that's not fair. It's very easy to see that, but you need to leave it before you can even begin to understand what it is. So, yeah. Pleasure.
I have 2 questions, if I may. One quick one. You know the school that you attended, who was it owned by and who governed that? My second question was, you started your talk on talking about polarizations, black and white, Tory Labour, and moving towards a world that is increasingly polarized. What, in your opinion, is ways to depolarize it?
Yeah, okay. Firstly, it was Fort Victoria Junior School. It was a government-run school, so the government schools were exceptional, but they were all government-run schools. And then you had private schools, so there was an independent sector out there. Now, the independent sector has become very strong, because anybody with money has put their child, they've taken their child out of, I mean, you're talking about class sizes of 60 children in the government schools now. Now, you saw that photograph, there were probably, 20, 25 children in a class. So I think it's naturally going to happen when you go from 200,000 white people to 5,200,000 people. The infrastructure wasn't there. But they were government-run schools. What was your second? The polarization. I think we've all got to, we've got to be very careful with technology, because we all know that once you start clicking on things, the algorithms give you more of the same. So I think we're reading more and more of the same material. It's given to us. And what we encourage, we have something at school called debating hobby, and you have to take a stance. The idea is that I think the only way that you can depolarize is that you have to get people to try to understand what it is to argue from the other perspective. Because if you have to argue the opposite thing, even if you don't believe it, it means you've got to get under the skin. I was in a recent TPR lesson where the children had to argue to maintain the slavery rules and what have you in America. And you could see these kids saying, well, I don't know how to argue, because they've seen how history has unfolded. But the reality is you've got to understand the mindset. Let's go to Rhodesia. You've got to understand the mindset of a white terrified person who has a lifestyle who's going to have that lifestyle taken away. And they think it's wrong to lose it. And you have to understand where they're coming from, I think, and understand their fear and have sympathy for that fear, because it's all they know at the moment. But if you can start to understand it, you might be able to help them to understand your side. It's not easy. I talk about the grey. The grey is the most important part. Between black and white, all the fun things happen in the grey. All the interesting things happen in the grey. The interesting people live in the grey. When you meet interesting people, they don't just have a strong black view over here or white view. They'll say, well, hold on, there's another part to that story. They'll tease out all the nuancing. They'll find other stories. And for me, the interesting people are the ones who take time to understand both sides of an argument. But it's not easy. And we were talking earlier, I was talking earlier with some gentlemen. I think when times were good, it's easy to share. And did you notice 20 years ago, we didn't have the polarization that we have now because there was a bit more plentifulness? Don't get me wrong, there's still hardship in different parts, but I think hardship is everywhere. Every country, every government is finding it difficult now, aren't they? And when it's hard, what do? We protect our own. When it's hard, we start to say, well, we're not going to share. We're not going to give money for aid. And we as families start to say, well, I can't give that much money to charity because we've got our own family to think about. And that's hard to encourage people. This is the time we need more giving than ever before. That's a hard message, isn't it? But I think that's where the grey is. And the grey's here. Zainab invited me here today as a Christian who leads a school of lots of faiths. And I love that my 3 children went through a school where they were the minority. And I love that they were in the minority. They need to know what it is to be in the minority, whether it's skin, faith, whatever. I think it's important.
Thank you very much. If we continue the questions, we'd be here for quite a while, so hopefully it's okay to cut it there, but we do, if anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to ask him afterwards. Please, can we have a round of applause?
Could I just end with one thing? If you could just drop the lights for 1 second. Is it okay to drop the lights for one second? So this is the church that I go to. Is that on the screen? So this is a church that I attend, and now it's got yew trees on the site. And what I love is I love working in wood. I'm an art teacher, design teacher, and what I love is the yew tree has this ability to stay green all year round, and it's a symbol of immortality. One of the few conifers that can produce growth very easily. And I love working in wood. And so what I thought I'd do is I've got a little present to give to you. The reason why I've made this for you is I love that the colours are so different on both sides, but they meet in the middle. And on the outside of the bark, we've got whatever the tree looks like. But the reality is on the inside, so faith is about being light, yes? Being the light and the salt of the earth. So I'd like to leave that with you. And if you ever want to live in the grey, live in the grey. Live in that little space between those two. Okay, so that's a little gift for you. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. That's very kind, and thank you very much for your talk today. Just a quick announcement. Next week, in the light of depolarization, we have Sayyid Amir Hussain Askari, who is from the US, a postdoctoral research associate in natural law, who's going to be talking about the Quranic concept of fitra, a bridge to interreligious understanding and collaboration. So hopefully, continuing the theme. The week after, we have Rida Jishi, who'll be speaking to us on the 6th Iman Shahadat, and the week after, we have Hala Kher, who's the advocacy and research officer at Medical Aid for Palestinians, who'll be speaking to us on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the role of aid agencies. We do have regular programs on an ongoing basis every Monday, Mums and Tots at 11 to 12:30, and ladies Pilates at 7:30 to 8:30. On Tuesday we have yoga at 6 to 7 p.m. and ladies exercise classes at 7:15 to 8:15. Wednesday we have karate and taekwondo 6:30 to 7:30. Thursdays we have Dua Kumail and Surya Yasin where applicable at 8 p.m. And then obviously our Friday talks that will be that are on the screen every week. On Saturdays we have the Women's Walking Club and Sikkim Tuition, and on Sundays we have Tafsir class as well as Hosseini Madrasa and Soul Kitchen, the food bank, which is here at midday to 1 p.m. If you'd like to volunteer or get involved in any of our programs, please speak to a member of the executive committee. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.